My name is Catherine Welch, and I am a student project manager at the Clarke Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. On behalf of the Clarke Forum, Dickinson College, the Churchill Fund, and the Departments of Anthropology, Political Science, Middle East Studies, and Sociology, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Islam in the West, A Clash of Civilizations. This event is part of the Clarke Forum's spring semester theme, The War at Home. In 1992, political scientist Samuel P. Huntington proposed a theory called the Clash of Civilizations, which suggested that, in a post-Cold War world, conflict would arise from cultural and religious differences rather than from political ideologies. The theory was both praised and criticized. Since the attacks of September 11, 2001, which were carried out by Islamist extremist terrorist group Al-Qaeda, there has been a renewed interest in understanding the relationship between the Islamic world and the West. Huntington's thesis has played a key role in this discussion, both as a proposed theory for explaining the conflicts of today and as an example of Orientalist thought. Tonight, Ambassador Akbar Ahmed will discuss Huntington's thesis in the context of the post-9/11 United States, based on his recent research examining relations between the West and the Islamic world. Ambassador Ahmed is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University. In addition to his teaching at American, he has held positions at Harvard, Yale, and the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, where he became the first distinguished chair in Middle East and Islamic Studies. Ahmed served as Pakistan High Commissioner to the United Kingdom and Ireland for the Civil Service of Pakistan, and is the author of multiple books regarding relations between Islam and the West since 9/11, including Journey into Islam, The Crisis of Globalization, Journey into America, The Challenge of Islam, and the forthcoming Journey into Europe, Islam, Immigration, and Empire. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. A question and answer session will follow tonight's lecture, so please hold all questions until the end. To begin tonight's program, we will watch a short video with a poem written by Ambassador Ahmed titled At the Khyber Pass, about the pass between Central and South Asia, which, in the words of Ambassador Ahmed, has seen more history than any place in the world. The poem will help us begin this journey with Ambassador Ahmed.
At the Khyber Pass. There's nothing spectacular or even dramatic in the climb or the mountains, but the air is almost tense in its silence, so insolently indifferent to me and my times. Here all is awe and hush. Far beyond the pass, Kabuls and Samarkands, all that the urban imagination conjures in nostalgia, the mainsprings of conquest that flooded the fat lands this side of the pass, Delhi and Agra, the irresistible lakes of journey's end. The ear strains to hear, and almost does, the distant din of battle, the clang and clamor of men at war, steel ringing on steel, cries of death and victory, of hooves galloping hard from war for the secret treasures of the Ganges. Kingdoms rising as swiftly as the stroke of a scimitar and vanishing as swiftly. These putty-colored mountains seem to suggest with supreme indolence, you who would stride and strut and swear, look on us and wonder. They say there was an empire once, and that recently, on which the sun never set. Today, its legacy is a toy train, some cement blocks in tidy heaps to stop German tanks, if you please, and some insignia and escutcheons scratched like military badges on the shoulders of wayside rocks. Fading and exotic memories of Gurkha and Sikh, plump, open-mouthed lizards sitting so still they could be part of the regimental emblem. Like wind they came, like water they left. The thousands of soldiers, the thousands of years, passages long gone, long forgotten, in this catacomb of desire and history. Afridi and Shinwari, and before them old Tathara, watch from eagle eyes. O conqueror, gaze on these and wonder. O traveler, be warned and step softly. The hills seem to know, and the air whispers, this evanescent journey, this mad rush will continue, will remain as desperate and as passionate as of yore. But to this end we must come, silence beyond and silence behind. To this end, teasing imagination leads us and leaves us.
And now I ask that you please join me in welcoming Ambassador Akbar Ahmed.
Thank you so much, Katie, for that very warm introduction. Zeenat, my wife, and I are delighted and honored to be here on this historic campus, the Cool School. And it is our first visit, and so far it's been great. Let me now plunge straight into my subject. Visualize for a moment how the world seems to people outside this campus, to millions and millions of people. Charlie Hebdo in Paris, killings in Copenhagen, the Boko Haram in West Africa, Al-Shabaab in East Africa, Saudis and the Yemenis, the Houthis, engaged in conflict and war. Further east, the Tehreek-e-Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan. In Pakistan, 150 school children killed on campus, younger than you students on this campus. School children blown up. Churches attacked in Lahore, 2 churches simultaneously. So the world seems to be in a state of total chaos. And we on campus must engage with the reality around us. We must bring our collective wisdom, our disciplines, to try to make some sense of the world we live in. And that is the subject of my talk this evening. Because when conflict is so overtly focused on one religion, we assume it's Islam versus the West. When you begin to look closer, you'll see that so many ugly strains in society begin to surface. Anti-Semitism is one of them. It's again rearing its ugly head. In Europe, certainly, I've just come back from a detailed tour of Europe, and I met chief rabbis, I met rabbis, I met the senior rabbi of Munich after we just visited Dachau, the concentration camp. And he said, I have never been so depressed since the last half century. So, violence, bigotry, hatred are not simple emotions. They unleash and trigger other emotions, other prejudices. It's a slippery slope. Sikhs have been attacked, Sikh temples have been attacked here in the United States. Students on campus in Chapel Hill were shot, 3 students. Now, there was some reason, some excuse, debate about the parking and so on. But these incidents are happening with such frequency that they must force us to pause and say, is this correct? Is this where we really want our societies to be heading? Now, in order to make sense of the world we are living in, we have to first of all begin to see it not through a Christian or a Muslim or a Jewish lens. We really have to look at it through the lens of a common humanity. Because we are in a rather frail boat. And that boat is very vulnerable. It can be attacked at any time. In a plane, in a bus, in a church, in a school, What is sacrosanct? Kenya, you just saw an attack in a hostel. You guys live in hostels. You're on a campus. How safe is anyone? So the first big point I want to make, I think a fundamental strategic mistake we make is to try to analyze in terms of us versus them. It will not succeed if we want to solve the problems of this world. We have to look at it and say, this is a problem that concerns all of us, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Americans, non-Americans, because it must stop. The world is faced with enormous global problems. We have the problem of hunger, of poverty, of global warming. We have huge problems, and these problems have to be tackled. And they cannot be tackled if half the time we are not even sure whether we'll survive till the morning or not. Now, greater minds than mine have been engaged with precisely this question. How do we analyze the world we live in? Katie mentioned Professor Huntington, and I've had the extraordinary honor of debating Professor Huntington, being one of the last, before he passed away a decade ago, to debate him, of debating the person who actually gave us the phrase, the clash of civilizations, Professor Bernard Lewis at Princeton. I've debated him several times, talked to him because he's a senior colleague, about Islam and the position of the world today. And I think we have to be very careful when we say the clash of civilizations, because when people use this concept, they use it as a caricature. Neither of these professors meant it to mean what we take it to mean, which is a straightforward war between the West and the world of Islam. Both theses are much, much more nuanced, and so we have to be careful. Bernard Lewis, in fact, very categorically talks about a clash of civilizations if there is no dialogue of civilizations. He doesn't just say there's only clash. There is no dialogue, which is what a lot of people interpret him saying. Now, it is a powerful thesis. There's no denying it. It's easy to dismiss. I mentioned Saudi and Yemen, both Muslim countries. Iraq and Iran who fought for a decade. A million people died, both Muslim countries. In North Africa, you have constantly Muslim countries fighting Muslim countries. Where is the clash of civilizations there? Over the last century, we saw Europe in turmoil, Germany versus England, Christian country versus Christian country, versus the United States, Christian country. So again, we have to be very careful about how we apply this simple, powerful idea of a clash. It's a powerful idea. And you can back it up with arguments that for 1,000 years, we've had the Crusades, we've had colonization, we've had the Ottomans almost taking Vienna twice. You look at the patterns of history, yes, there has been a clash. But then look at it from the other perspective. There's so much synthesis. There's so much overlap. There's so much mutual taking and giving. The borders are interweaving, crossing over, going into each other's territories. It isn't that simple as I think people understand it to be. So we have to be very cautious with the concept of the clash. It also can be a self-fulfilling thesis. After 9/11, I saw this. I was sitting in Washington. I was seeing the media scrambling around for the answer that President Bush articulated so well when he said, "Why do they hate us?" And all of America wanted to know, what the hell has happened here? Here we are getting on with our lives, and suddenly 3,000 Americans are dead. Innocent Americans, completely innocent. And many of them, by the way, Muslims. Hundreds of Muslims died in those attacks. So what happened? Now, that is when a lot of media people looking around for an answer found it in the clash of civilizations. It's very attractive, it just fitted in. Well, this is happening because there's always been and always will be a clash of civilizations. And here's evidence, another evidence of the clash. But what happens a couple of years later? It all sorts of fizzles out. America is now in the field supporting Iran in one theater of war, supporting Saudi Arabia against Iran in another theater war, all the lines are crossed. There are no clear lines anymore. So we have to be sensitive to all the really fundamental flaws in this idea of the clash. So I wouldn't find that a convincing explanation of what's happening. Now, the economists would say the problems stem from economic deprivation. These are poor people revolting. This is Marxism. The challenge of the poor against the capitalists, the rich, the corrupt, the imperialists. Here again you have to be careful because a lot of the turmoil is coming out of the middle class people. Osama bin Laden comes from a very rich and privileged background. A lot of the hijackers, in fact, were engineers, educated, articulate people who were certainly dissatisfied, but they were not quite Marxist in their compulsions. So again, we have to be careful about the idea that only poor people are revolting and are involved in this violence. There are also a lot of people, and don't underestimate the numbers, millions of people, who actually believe on both sides, here in the United States and in the Muslim world, that these wars, this chaos, these are symptoms of the end of times. Judgment Day, the apocalypse is on us. It's over. Time is over for us as a human species. God is rolling it all up, rolling up the carpet and saying, okay guys, you've had your day now. Let me judge how you behaved on earth. It's over. So the Judgment Day idea also is catching on among a lot of people, and you're seeing people simply saying, all right, you expect this of the end of days, so this violence is expected, and therefore they numb themselves to the violence, to this horrific violence, kids being killed, women being killed, women being raped. I mean, what ISIS is doing in the Middle East, raping women, killing people, selling them, beheading them, it makes absolutely no sense. And by the way, 99% of their victims are Muslim. So that makes even less sense. There is no pattern at all. There seems to be completely fragmented and broken down. There are other theorists trying to make sense of the world, who would say this violence is really coming from Islam itself. Islam predisposes Muslims towards violence. If you read the Quran, you read certain verses, they provoke Muslims to be violent. So potentially, every Muslim is primed to be violent, and he needs some catalyst to set him or her off, and he'll become violent. Now this again is a very shaky argument. First of all, the argument about Huris, these 72 or 82, I'm never sure of the numbers, virgins waiting in heaven for the martyrs, that doesn't even exist in the Quran. And I've spent 40 years reading the Quran. I haven't seen that in the Quran. And yet you'll hear this argument that the Quran promises 72 virgins. So the people who blow themselves up for the 72 virgins have obviously been misguided. And this thesis is so easily negated when you begin to understand the nature of religion, the nature of theology, which text, which verses from which text cannot be interpreted in different ways. If there are violent texts in the Quran, and you can debate them, there are equally violent verses in the Bible, in the Jewish scriptures, in the Hindu scriptures, in any scripture in the world. So again, where does this take you? If you argue on this basis, where is it going to lead you? It's simply going to lead you to the conclusion that, well, all religions have a violent base to them, or their scriptures can be interpreted in a violent way. And counter to this argument, of course, is the argument of many Muslims, like me, for example, a scholar of Islam, who would say that if the God of Islam defines himself as Rahman and Rahim, the two most vital words in the Quran describing God. God in the Quran has 99 names, 99 attributes, beautiful attributes. of these two of the greatest attributes which Muslims repeat all day. All day Muslims will repeat this before eating, before sleeping, before speaking, that God is merciful and God is compassionate. The Prophet of Islam is described in the Quran as a mercy unto mankind. Now I ask myself, when I hear ISIS saying kill them all and murder them all, how can I, as a Muslim, taking my inspiration from my faith, which is defined by mercy, how can I then abandon that and become violent? It doesn't make sense to me. So this is something I believe Islamic theologians have to grapple with and come up with proper, legitimate answers rooted in study, because the criticism against it is not valid, but nor have the answers been satisfactory that we are hearing in the media. Now, some scholars, moving on to another explanation of what's going on, like Edward Said, give us a more neo-imperialist frame that what you're seeing is really the turmoil, the continuation of the imperialist Western powers who look on African and Asian societies as Orientalist societies. They look down on them with contempt and disdain. And that Orientalism is still continuing. So really what you're seeing is a continuation of Western forces in Iraq and Afghanistan and East Africa and so on, and that will create the turmoil in those societies. They will argue that ISIS is a direct product, a direct result of the Iraq war. So you can see there's several big ideas out there in play. And you can choose one of these ideas or several of these ideas or develop your own ideas, but there is no one dominating, overarching idea to explain our world. Now, in order to make sense for myself and my students, as an anthropologist, and I'm delighted that Professor Hill has brought her anthropology students here today, and as a former administrator in the tribal area belt of Pakistan, I noted that this violence is coming from two kinds of people. One acting individually, so you have what's called the lone wolf, someone who just goes off and does something violent, so he acts on his own. And the second, individuals who act as part of a larger network. Maybe they belong to Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or the Tehreek-e-Taliban, a group. If we look at the bigger groups, go geographically west to east, from West Africa, Boko Haram, West Africa, move to East Africa, Al-Shabaab, move into the Yemen, Al-Qaeda there, move into the Middle East, ISIS, further east, Taliban, into Pakistan, Tehreek-e-Taliban. All these groups have several things in common. And as an anthropologist, I was very excited to discover that there is a pattern, there is a method in the madness if you analyze it and go under the surface. And we will now go under the surface of these terrible groups. In my last book, The Thistle and the Drone, I took 40 case studies from Morocco, across North Africa, the Middle East, right up to the Caucasus Mountains, in Russia, 40 case studies of tribal groups living on the periphery of nations. 40 groups. 40 groups with their own territory, 40 groups which are described by anthropologists as belonging to the segmentary lineage system, so a certain kind of tribe. 40 groups with a common descent system, so everyone in the group has a common ancestor. Very often the group is called after the common ancestor. So note what's going on here. They have territory, they have a name, they have an identity, and they've been there for thousands of years. That is where the problem is. The problem is now more complicated. Now I want you to shift to the Muslim world where the problem is taking place and try to understand it. That's why I introduced you to the poem I wrote about the Khyber Pass. In the Muslim world, in the vast majority of Muslim societies, the notion of tribalism has not died out. And tribe simply means a kinship group, that we belong to a certain descent group. Now call it ethnic group, call it ethnicity, call it a social group, a descent group, or a tribe. But these individuals are related to each other and define themselves as related to each other. And they are alive. Examples: Saudi Arabia. The entire country, one of the most powerful countries in the Middle East, is named after a tribe. Just think of the significance of this. The whole country belongs to one tribe, and that tribe rules the country. Elite members of the tribe are all the princes. They run it, they own the wealth, they own the top jobs. They have the power in their hands. Balochistan, almost half of Pakistan, is called Balochistan after the Baloch tribe. Afghanistan is called Afghanistan after the Pashtun tribe. Afghan means Pashtun. Pashtun is the dominant tribe of Afghanistan. The entire country is called after the Pashtun tribes. So you can see that these tribes are not history, they are alive and they are there. And it's a reality that either the state, or they're dominating the state, or you need to negotiate with them in order to understand that particular state. Now, if you understand this, then you will understand that the relationship between the central government and the tribes in the periphery now becomes vital. Because when these countries are formed in the last century, after colonization, the relationship between the center and the periphery becomes an unhappy one as the center begins to encroach on the tribes. They do not give them their democratic rights. They do not give them the economic share. They do not give them the respect and dignity that citizens should have. They humiliate them. They appropriate their wealth. And this is happening again in my 40 case studies. So the tribes begin to do what they do. They respond. They respond in anger. They are motivated by something called the code of honor. The code of honor is important to them. That's what defines them. The person living in the city, in Cairo or Karachi, will not be motivated by a code of honor. He has a civil code, the code of the state. But the tribesmen will still function according to the code of honor. The code of honor means, number one, hospitality. Number two, courage. Number three, revenge. Revenge is very important in the code of honor. There's a famous saying among the Pashtuns in Afghanistan: I took revenge after 100 years and I took it too soon. So fathers pass on their revenge to their sons and their grandsons. It must be completed. Now, you see how tribes and the central governments are now set on a collision course over the last half century. Why? Well, take a look at the rulers of the Muslim world. You have Saddam Hussein in Iraq. You have Assad in Syria. These are brutal dictators. They're suppressing the tribes in the periphery. They're brutalizing them. And as a response, the tribes will now attack the center. They'll kidnap people, they'll blow themselves up, and they'll be doing a lot of these violent acts that we are seeing now. What you're seeing now in all these areas is a complete breakdown of relations between center and periphery. So in effect, what you're seeing is a very intense internal conflict. And instead of seeing wisdom on both sides, you're seeing an implosion of society. Now, the United States would be very wisely advised to understand that this is essentially an internal crisis. If we go charging in and get involved, we will A, not have an idea of what we want out of this conflict, and B, how to go about wanting what we want, which we don't know. And that is why we sometimes end up fighting one group over here and being allies of it over there. And that confuses us and them. That is the reality of what is taking place. Now again, analyze these groups that I mentioned to you and see where the drones are being used in the war on terror. The drones have been used almost exclusively where there are tribes. Same tribes, the segmentary lineage systems. Against the Pashtuns, against the Yemenis, against the Kurds, against the Somalis. Everywhere the drones have been used. So there's again another correlation that I want to give you. Another correlation is these same tribes, because the code of honor is breaking down, it's these same tribes who were responsible, if you recall, for blowing up the Bamiyan statues. Does anyone remember the statues at Bamiyan? Does that mean anything? Can someone tell me what? You're nodding your head. What were the statues in Bamiyan? These were the magnificent statues of the Buddha in the Bamiyan Valley of Afghanistan. And they had stood there for centuries. And we were privileged, my wife and I, to actually visit and see these statues. The first thing the Taliban did, just on the eve of 9/11, was to blow up the statues. The ISIS tribesmen blew up Nimrod. At Nimrod, they blew up the most ancient, most priceless statues in the Middle East. Now think to yourself, if you believe in one of these theories, if you believe in the theory that Islam is violent and crazy religion, you're going to say, well, they're Muslims and they're fanatics. But then ask yourself, how come these same statues have survived over 1,000 years of Muslim history? Muslim kings have come and gone and no one has touched them. The Muslim kingdoms, Afghanistan has been Muslim for over 1,000 years. Bamiyan statues were there, untouched. And suddenly the Taliban come and blow them up. The reason is, again, center periphery. In order to hurt the center, in order to do something so outrageous, so shocking, that the world would condemn the center, the periphery will do an act like this one, which is blow up a statue, kill school children, violate women. The Boko Haram kidnapping 200 schoolgirls. Does that make any sense? 200 schoolgirls are kidnapped. The Taliban kill 150 school children. These are absolutely disgusting acts, and they shock society. But that's exactly what they want. The idea is to scandalize and shock society. So keep this in mind. You have the center with the Air Force, tanks, armies, unrelenting violence. You have the periphery, fragmented, violent, lashing out. And that is the situation. It's classic center versus periphery gone berserk. And that is why you need a great deal of wisdom and courage at the center, at the central government. And I'm afraid to say I don't see either at this present stage in our world history. Now, for those of you who may doubt, you're not really convinced that there's a tribal base to this, let me point out a few facts. 9/11, 19 hijackers. If I were to tell you that 18 out of the 19 belong to one particular tribe, if I were to tell you that Osama bin Laden also belonged to that tribe, that his aide said that 95% of Al-Qaeda belonged to that particular tribe, and that Osama bin Laden named the last two houses that he lived in, the one in Kandahar in Afghanistan and the one in Abbottabad in Pakistan, the last two houses, both of them he named after tribes, I think you would be convinced. So here's the pattern for you, that beneath the discussion about Islam and the war on terror and clash of civilizations, you see another very distinct pattern that emerges, which is the periphery, the tribe, in motion and in play, which we overlook. So we are not really looking for it, and therefore we are not easily able to spot it. Why? Because these tribes are living in the interstices, in between things, between the two states. Taliban live between Afghanistan and Pakistan. They're in the border areas. So they're neither quite with one country nor quite with the other country. When I was in charge of Waziristan, again, Waziristan, called after the Wazir tribe. Half my tribes were in Afghanistan, half in Pakistan. So very often, someone would commit murder in my part of the territory and cross over into Afghanistan. Now, how do I get hold of him? He's in a different country. They played the border brilliantly. So in order to counter that, I had to come up with a strategy to get my man, and that's something that we can discuss in the Q&A. There is another related issue in all this, and that is the issue of Muslims living in the West. Muslims living in the West now are causing a lot of discussion, controversy, debate about their status. Before 9/11, there was no problem. Today, there is a problem and an issue. There is an issue, certainly in Europe, when something like 5,000 Muslims, maybe 6,000, have gone from Europe to fight alongside ISIS against European troops. Why is this happening? Why should a young man or a young woman give up a comfortable life with all the possibilities that Western societies offer, education, health facilities, a future, employment, everything, and go and throw their lives away and the lives of their families? Now again, there are many answers, and we need to explore these answers. And again, I think that the answers are linked to the first set of theories that I raised earlier, and we can explore them again in the Q&A session. So, in order to try to make some sense and really understand for myself what is going on and back up these theories and ideas that I had, I did what anthropologists do, which is to go to the field and test my own theories in the field against data, hard ethnography. So for a decade now, I've been traveling with a group of young scholars, mostly American scholars from my university. We've been to the Middle East, South Asia, Far East Asia. We looked at Islam, looking at the West. Then I spent a year, my sabbatical year, traveling in the United States. I went to 75 cities. I went to 100 mosques. And here I looked at how Americans are looking at Muslims. And then my next project, I looked at the interstices between the states, that is tribal Islam. And that was the thistle and the drone. And my latest project, Journey into Europe, is based again on fieldwork. Again, I visited about 40 mosques, talked to 40 imams, talked to chief rabbis, presidents, prime ministers, students, professors right across Europe, east, west, north, south, and again to try to grapple with these questions. Why are so many Muslims leaving to join ISIS? Why are so many converts leaving to join ISIS? You'd expect a European to become a Muslim and say, all right guys, let me help try to act as a bridge, bring people together. But a lot of converts are moving to ISIS. What is going on? This man whose voice was identified beheading the hostage in the Middle East on behalf of ISIS, he came from London. It makes no sense to me. And yet, as social scientists, as scholars, we need to find the answers. So I believe that these are some steps we need to be taking, and I hope that in our session now, the Q&A, we'll be able to explore some of this. I believe the first most important step in this exercise, facing all of us, is the need to understand that there is a problem. There is no glib, simple answer. And you cannot shout down the other side, you have to hear the other side. You cannot simply say, I have the answer. because I have a bigger megaphone. Because if you have a bigger megaphone, it's not working. You have a problem. So we must acknowledge that we have a problem. The second step needs to be to start educating ourselves about the problem, to really understand what is going on. And I've just given you briefly in a half an hour or so a presentation of how easily it is to see the same thing, like that famous elephant in a room with the wise men. You may recall the story. Do you recall the story, or do you want to hear it? Hear it? Well, it's a very famous story. I've heard it with regard to Rumi, the great Sufi mystic, but it's applied to sages everywhere, maybe your own wise professors on this campus. So the story is that there was a king, and he had these very wise counselors who would always argue with themselves. So to show them that no one of them possessed all the answers, he brought in an elephant in a room and had the room darkened. And then asked the professors, all blindfolded, to come into that room and touch what they felt in that room, in the dark room, blindfolded, and describe what they felt that thing was, that object was. So someone held the ear of the elephant and said, I think this is a fan. It's a big fan. Someone held the leg of the elephant and said, this is certainly a pillar. It seems just like a pillar. Someone felt the trunk and said, this is a python, an enormous snake. And then when the lights came on, the wise men realized they were all holding the same object from different parts. So we need to understand this problem which I described from these different perspectives, and then begin to say, all right, this is what it looks like. Now let's try to solve it this way. The first 2 or 3 things that need to be done immediately, and that has to be done because the situation is spiraling out of control, is to try to arrest the collapse of law and order. The law and order must be arrested, especially in the West. Because right now, what I saw was the security forces have become very active, and the community, the Muslim community where the problem is coming from, are fragmented. So you have a Muslim community with the religious and political leadership divided, unsure, even paranoid, and you have security forces very, very aggressive. There's a mismatch. The two must work together. Without working together, it will not work. You need those religious scholars to be telling the community, talking to the young, guiding them. When you're 18 years old, you're very uncertain about life. You're not even sure what's going to happen tomorrow. And you expect these kids to be able to interpret the Quran and interpret life and interpret the Sharia and go off and give their lives for a cause they don't understand. And yet this is what's happening. There's little communication between the young generation and the older generation. So these youngsters, these Muslim youngsters, very often go online and listen to some sheikh somewhere in the Middle East. They're lured to the Middle East, and next you know, another one's gone to join the jihad. Now I'm studying this for my new project, and believe me, this is what's happening. There's so many young people, especially girls, 16-year-old, 17-year-old girls, from Britain, from France, who are packing up suddenly and leaving. And their parents are the most shocked. They're saying, where is this coming from? Why is this happening? So this is the second thing, the interaction between the security and the community leaders, the religious and the political. Third, these youngsters must get a sense that they're living in a society which will be fair to them. I'm talking about the young now, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. They are citizens. The third generation of British Muslims, Turks in Germany, are citizens. They've grown up in that country. But they don't feel that they are part of that country. They don't feel that they are fully accepted. They still feel that there's prejudice against them. Rightly or wrongly, this is what they feel. They must feel part of that society. If they don't, you have a vulnerable individual who can easily be swayed. We have to address the young. The vast population of the Muslim world is very, very young, perhaps the highest percentage in the world among Muslims of young. We must address them in their language and win them over. We have to understand the greater philosophy that must drive our understanding, that violence only begets more violence. And in the end, it is no answer. If it was the answer, you'd have surely heard Jesus Christ, Gandhi, or Mandela, or Mother Teresa, all these great figures in history, saying, "Go, my son, go and kill people, behead them, slaughter them." But they constantly talked of peace, of turning the other cheek, of understanding. So we need to tamper down on the violence, because that in itself is simply generating more violence and more violence and more violence. The Chinese sages say that when you point a finger at someone and accuse them, 3 of your fingers are pointing back at you. So we need to understand that we also are part of the problem. We have to accept that and say, let us sit down together and solve this problem, because we cannot allow this problem to carry on as it's carrying on. So far, it is not showing any signs of abating. When editors in offices are not safe, school children in school are not safe, worshippers in a church are not safe, worshippers in a synagogue are not safe, in a mosque are not safe, who is safe? So with that, we need to keep this motto before us, this beautiful motto that you'll be familiar with from the Jewish texts, Tikkun Olam, which is to go out and heal a fractured world. Thank you.
It's now time for the question and answer session. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to reach you before asking it.
Thank you, Professor. It was very interesting. I was reminded when you were speaking, right here.
Yes.
I was reminded when you were speaking, there's a story about Lyndon Johnson getting a briefing from a group of Middle East experts. And they were informing him on all the complexities of the region, religious differences, tribal differences. And at a certain point, Johnson kind of rose from his seat and said, "Therefore what?" And I think I'd like you to go a little further with the "therefore what" answer, sir.
Well, you've quoted Johnson, and let me also quote you someone from that time. Kennedy was president when he received the President of Pakistan at Mount Vernon. And that was a rare honor to any head of state, as you know. It's rare that there's a state function, a state dinner at Mount Vernon itself. And just Google the visit. It's on Google. Google the visit. The words he spoke about the President of Pakistan and about Pakistan. And then Kennedy, a very bold man with a vision, a lot of courage, sent his wife Jackie Kennedy to Pakistan. And I want you to look at a picture of Jackie Kennedy, again Google it, 1962, in Lahore. Now visualize this. Jackie Kennedy, very elegant, beautiful woman, standing proud and straight in an open car in Lahore alongside the President of Pakistan, with hundreds of Pakistanis smiling and grinning and throwing flower petals at her. And then Jackie goes to the Khyber Pass, which you just saw here, and there she's greeted by the tribal chiefs who just go crazy about her. They mob her and they give her presents and they sacrifice goats and all sorts of things for her. And we should ask ourselves, what happened? We were that loved then. Ask ourselves, could today any American stand forget an open car, in an armored car in Lahore, or even think of going to the Khyber Pass? So the world has changed over here and over there. So when you talk about Johnson, the great merit that Johnson had in asking questions like this, he was a very practical man. But the impression I had of his dealings with our part of the world was that he was also a very fair man who stood by his friends. And that's something people understood. Another famous story of Johnson, and I can quote you the source. This story was told to us, in fact, when we were in Pakistan last year, by Gohar Ayub Khan, the eldest son of President Ayub Khan, the President of Pakistan. Gohar was the ADC to the President of Pakistan when Johnson visited Pakistan. And he told me the story. He said that they were driving with President Johnson and his father, the President of Pakistan, to Karachi. They'd gone into the interior for some shoot. They were driving into Karachi, and Johnson saw a camel cart. In those days, the camel carts in Pakistan was a camel and a big cart, and very often the guy sitting on the cart, because it was moving at 1 mile per hour, so he just sit there or fall asleep, and the camel would just go along and reach Karachi in about 3 days' time. So Johnson passed this camel driver and then said, "Stop." And the cavalcade stopped. And Gohar Ayub told us that his father was very curious. He said, "Why do you want to stop here in the middle of nowhere? There's maybe a security risk if we suddenly stop here." And he said, "No, I want to see the face of that man. He has a very spiritual face. It reminds me of the image of Jesus Christ on a cross." And President Ayub Khan was taken aback by that. And they called the poor camel driver, who was petrified. Suddenly you had all these police and American guards and so on yanking him off the cart and bringing him in front of the president and the vice president. And Johnson then invited the camel driver to Texas, gave him a huge truck, and he was on, I think, Time magazine, cover of Life, and the stories on him. And he never recovered from that trip. He came back and said, "As President Johnson and so said this to me." So Johnson had a lot of fans also, because he had that kind of very human touch in his dealings with people, and an earthy wisdom. Yes, you had a question? Oh, yes.
First of all, assalamu alaikum. I had a question about, it's twofold, about the United States' role in, as of now, what would be the United States' role in regards to Islam and terrorism and everything? Because it seems to me that a very naive perspective the United States has been given. The U.S. played a crucial role in the establishment of the United Nations, and some of those aspects include peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace enforcement. But in the Middle East, whether it's Iran, Iraq, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, it's always been the United States funding one group to go to war with another group of Muslims. But we seem to forget that. And also in regard to terrorists, so when we think of terrorists, we completely just categorize them as illiterate people that are supporting jihad, aren't really, don't really know what they're doing. But if you look at Sandy Hook, Colorado, Timothy McVeigh, we'd say that they're mentally challenged. So instead of receiving psych evaluations, we send them to Guantanamo Bay or Abu Ghraib to be tortured mercilessly. And we don't even say, do they suffer from schizophrenia or psychosis or a host of other diseases. So in regards to U.S. foreign policy starting now, and as well as treatment of terrorists abroad, what would you say would be our next step?
Well, I think you've given a lot of the answers to your own questions, because they were more statements than questions. If you're asking what the role of the U.S. should be or has been, do you want to know what should be now? Well, the role of the United States has always been, any president of the United States has always stated, as any president of any country, that the role of the administration, the president, is to protect and project the interests of the nation. Simple as that. So after 9/11, the US perceived itself as having been attacked, and therefore it assumed a certain role. Today, it's been over a decade since that time. The President of the United States is taking a different role. He's trying to bring people together, trying to increase friends abroad in a very difficult environment, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, and also mindful of the internal politics of the United States. The role of the United States, as I see it, if you want my personal opinion, I will tell you the good news that as we traveled Europe, the most popular country in the world, in the Balkans, for example, is the United States. So many Muslims, I'm talking of Muslims, who told us in the Balkans, Albanians, Bosnians, Macedonians, Muslims, They told us that had it not been for the United States, we would not be alive today. There's no country in the world like the United States. So the United States, to me, really means, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of what it means to be American, it means, and I hope the students here are listening carefully, it means to interpret the vision of the founding fathers of this great country, to go back to source, to understand the founding fathers, to understand what Jefferson, Washington, Franklin had in mind when they were creating this country, what they had in mind when they wrote the Declaration and the Constitution. And there is a vision. It's a new vision. That vision did not exist in the world. There's that remarkable statue outside the University of Jefferson. I'm not sure how many of you have seen it, but if you haven't, go there, it's worth seeing. It's an eye-opener for Americans. And I'm sorry to say most Americans haven't seen it or heard of it. The statue has Jefferson and an angel. And the angel is holding a tablet. And the tablet says religious freedom. 1786. It says God, that's for the Christians, Yahweh for the Jews, Allah for the Muslims, Brahma for the Hindus. Now I thought to myself, 1786, and take a look around the world. You have kings who actually believe they're descended from the sun. They're children of the sun. And this is European kings. Forget Asian kings in Japan and so on. And here are people who are actually talking about embracing all of humanity. That's the vision the founding fathers had. When Jefferson dies, if you look at his graveyard, the three things he has on his tombstone, they do not include the fact that he was President of the United States. This is remarkable, absolutely remarkable. He's proud of what? He's proud of the constitution he's given his state, which rests in religious pluralism. This is a new country, a new vision of the world, a new society. Now, to me, these are vital things for Americans to understand. And I think we have a tendency today to be too accepting of the cliche that security takes all precedence, so throw everything out of the window, and as long as we survive, as long as we are pragmatic and somehow get through the temporary crisis, and give up what is permanent and of value. And what is of value is what it means to be American. So ultimately, I believe, and I've talked to thousands of Muslims across the world, the values of America, the values I'm talking to you about, humanity, compassion, knowledge, justice, family life, all these are ingrained in this vision of being an American. These resonate throughout the Muslim world. These are in fact Islamic virtues. This is where these great virtues of the great faiths and the American vision are totally compatible. But unfortunately, for most Muslims today, the only time they come across an American will be a drone 30,000 feet above, or some missile coming, or some central government using weapons given by the Americans. So they are not going to see America in a very positive light. And therefore you have all this hatred and the violence and so on. So you need to tie up the vision, the ideal, and what is happening. And this is where scholars can help.
I thank you for your presentation. I also must thank you for the gift you gave us in Journey Through America, a very comprehensive study. You are in the process of studying Europe. Could you give us your thoughts of the impact of American hubris and the impact that American hubris has had in the changing of the Muslim view of America?
Well, this is a very interesting question, because I'm very often asked to compare the two communities, Muslims in Europe, Muslims in the US. And this is how I do it very briefly. Muslims in the US had no problem. Again, go back to Kennedy and Johnson. They're the ones who opened up through the act in the mid-60s, which allowed Muslims from South Asia and the Middle East to come to the United States. And most of them coming here were middle-class Muslims, doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs. So they came straight into and became part of the American dream. Within 2 decades, they had good houses. They were accepted in the community. No one asked, "Doctor, where are you from? Which country are you from? What is your religion?" They just said, "He's a very friendly guy, he's an efficient guy, he's my doctor." 9/11 changed all that completely. So suddenly now Muslims became strangers. And now the questions were being asked: who are you? What is your religion? Does it preach hatred? Because simultaneously you had the birth of what is called Islamophobia. And this is an industry, you have to accept this. Just Google all this. There's studies called Fear Inc. Islamophobia. Just Google this and you'll see that there are centers dedicated to propagating hatred against Muslims. Literally. Millions of dollars go into them. All they do is they send out this rubbish against Islam, that it's violent, and there'll be a lot of stuff which is absolutely incorrect. But it has an impact. The man in Norway who killed 77 of his countrymen, you remember Anders Breivik? He shot 77 of his countrymen, men and women. He was citing American Islamophobes. He'd cite them on his website. So it's global now. So you pump it out from here, it's picked up in Europe, then it comes back here, we recycle it. Now when you have a minority as you have living here, and you have a minority which may be 2%, it's very, very tiny, it is not significant, and it is demonized, you have a potentially dangerous situation. And you're seeing that happening. Again, Google this, mosques are attacked, women in hijab are attacked. Why is it dangerous? Because it's also happening to the Sikh. A lot of people will see a man in a beard and a turban and they'll say, "Osama bin Laden, go home." Go home. Sikh drivers, taxi drivers will tell me this. They'll say that even now, so many years after 9/11, people will abuse us, shout at us, and we tell them we are not even Muslim. Or Hindus, Hindu women, with the traditional marking on the forehead, wearing a sari. In New York, someone pushed a Hindu woman onto the subway tracks, because they thought maybe she was a Muslim. So that's very dangerous. I see that as very dangerous. That is directly linked to anti-Semitism. Today it's the Muslims, tomorrow it'll be some other community. So that is the United States. Began with tremendous potential. This is a land of immigrants. Muslims should be treated like any other immigrants. They should be judged on their own merit. Europe is different. The European immigrants are coming from the former colonies. So Algerians come to France, former colony. Pakistanis, Indians come to Britain, former colony. In Germany, because Germany did not have colonies in the Muslim world, they had contracts with the Turks for guest workers. Very different pattern. The immigrants there are mainly illiterate working classes in the 1960s. The problem you're having now is with the third generation of that particular immigrant group. That is the problem you're having. Because that third generation feels neither European nor from their own world. So many told us, they said, when we go home, people will say, "All right, what gifts have you brought for us? Have you brought some money for us?" And when we give them the gifts, then they say, "Now you can go back because you're not Pakistani, you're not Bangladesh, you can go home." And when we come here, they say, "Well, you're not really part of our society. Why don't you go home?" So they really feel suspended. And when you're young, you're confused, you're very angry, you want to make something of your life, you want to contribute to society, and you feel frustrated. And who do you look up to? That's why I come back to the imam, the religious leader, the scholar. They don't have that figure. And they're wide open. You can take them this way or take them that way. So that's why we need to be thinking about these issues.
What role have popular democratic movements, often driven by young urbanites, such as in the Arab Spring, had to play in the dynamics between the heart and the periphery, and the delicate balance between tribal and central populations?
The relationship between tribe and state is a very complicated one and difficult one to understand. I met so many people in central government throughout the Muslim world who didn't even recognize it because they saw it in political terms. They said, "No, these areas are part of our country." I said, "Of course they're part of your country. But they're a different social group. They're a different social category. And they say, oh, these are backward people, these are illiterate people. They're a disgrace to our nation. Not unlike 200 years ago, you'd look at the Native Americans. Read the literature. White people looked down on the Native Americans. 100 years ago, white people looked down on the African Americans. Look at the literature here. Today it's different. Similarly, over there, there's a tendency to look down at people and say these are backward people. So young people who played this key role, and they've been very dynamic, and that's the hope that they're waking up and they are now involved and they want to change the world, which is not easy. As you saw, it was crushed in Egypt, it's being crushed in Syria, and the world is watching. They're learning the lesson that the world just doesn't care a damn for us. They talk about democracy and the youth and the rebellion of youth and so on, but they just don't care for us. We can be bombed, killed with chemical weapons, with every kind of horrible modern weaponry, and the world just lets us die. This is the feeling in Syria. The reality is that they are living day to day, and they're finding it very, very difficult in any of these countries. It is very difficult conditions. It's not like the United States. Here, you have the privilege of living in a genuinely free society. There you don't. Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran, these are not open, free societies. These are societies with intelligence agencies who do brutal things. You disappear. Your family is affected. Your parents come down on you and say, have you gone crazy? We'll all lose our jobs. We're all going to be tortured. We'll all be in trouble. So these are extraordinarily brave people who actually step out and do something. But the spectacular failure of that Arab Spring has really let down the entire Muslim world. And at this moment, I think youth is now pausing and saying, okay, what next? Because that enthusiastic momentum has not taken them to the changes that they hoped would happen.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned briefly the American dream and in accordance with religious freedom. Do you believe that even with the backlash from 9/11, with the government programs that are going on, such as sting operations and these interviews and detainments, that Muslim Americans or Middle Eastern Americans really can attain the American dream still, or if they're excluded from that?
I think that's a great question. And I think every American should ask that, because they're really asking it of themselves. When you ask it of a Muslim, you're really saying, suppose I was in that position tomorrow. Who would care for me? Because right now it's the Muslims, tomorrow it could be any other community. My answer to that is, I've met so many Muslims who even today would say, the best place in the world to be a Muslim is in the United States. And they'd say this, they'd say, I've never faced any kind of discrimination. I have 2 children, a son who makes movies, films, and a daughter who works with an organization which does a lot of good work with aid for development in countries like Africa and in Pakistan and so on. And they've never ever faced any kind of prejudice. And we keep asking them, are you sure you're all right? Have you faced any kind? And they say, we have the best friends, we're very comfortable, this is the best place in the world to be living, etc., etc. Now that is their experience. And yet you hear of stories. And the idea of the American dream is so powerful and so attractive. And that is why we must all fight for it. It's powerful because it reflects the vision of the founding fathers, whose vision was rooted in the idea of religious pluralism. You can come and share this dream and help make this a stronger nation, a better nation, a more worthy nation. And you've had that. You've had this generation upon generation of immigrants coming here and making it a better place. Now, I know that we have right now a somewhat shaky economy. We've been involved in wars, debts running up to trillions and trillions of dollars. We have these huge problems. But it's the time, as you're saying, we raise the issue of the American dream to stop and say, if we carry on down this path, how long before the American dream then is jeopardized? And that's a great question to start asking.
Hello. My question, a point that can be seen as a class of civilization and civilization values is within the clash between freedom of speech and the depiction of the Prophet Muhammad, as seen with the Dutch cartoonists or Charlie Hebdo. What is your view on that, and how does that relate to the greater debate we've had?
Yes, that's a very good question, because I was privileged to actually meet the editor in Copenhagen who commissioned the cartoons. And I was grateful that he met me, because he had no idea who the hell I was. I turned up with 2 or 3 of my American assistants who look rather tough. They all do weightlifting. So he may have thought, this guy is going to do something violent. So it was very nice of him to actually meet me, and we spent a very cordial couple of hours chatting. Now, the point I made to him was that he was absolutely right that anyone living in a certain country must respect the law of the land. There's no question. And there should be no debate, which involves freedom of speech. Now, this is sacred to the United States, to Europe. And it is a great achievement of civilization. We must all respect it. But we have to ask ourselves certain questions. And now let me quote the Pope. And I'm a big fan of the Pope. When the Pope was asked the same question that you asked, do you remember his answer? Who can do a good Italian accent? The Pope said, if you say something about my mother, you can expect a punch in your nose. Now, he was again in his own style, he's a very humane style. He was making a point. He was saying, look, it translates as going into a theater, coming in here and saying, fire, fire, run out. And in the stampede, some people die. Now, when you know you're going to do something which is going to cause death, I would think 3 times. Knowing I have the freedom to do it, I would think 3 times, say, would I rather have 10 people dead? Or would I say, all right, I'll tone this down simply because 10 people will die? I'm not doing it because I'm scared of someone. I'm doing it because of my compassion for humanity. That's one point. And he's not the only man who said this. I can quote you hundreds of people. Second point. A country like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, I can name you 24 countries. The constitution of those countries protects the name and character of the Prophet of Islam according to their religious belief. That's the law of the land. The constitution defends it. Like our constitution here gives us the right to free speech, the constitution there gives them the right to protect the honor of their prophet. Right? What do you do when you're in that country? Can you claim freedom of speech? Can you stand up there and say, okay, now I'll abuse the prophet? That would be courage. And that's what I'd like you to do. If you really believe in free speech, and you believe it's the right thing to do, then go there and do it. Because in about 3 seconds, you'll be arrested, taken off, and tried and convicted immediately of blaspheming. And that's the worst crime, and it's death penalty straight. Now, I would argue against it, because this is not the day and age to have a penalty like that and a punishment like that, but that's the law of the land. There's a parliamentary democracy. Now, unless you have that law change, you have that law. So you have to step back and say, okay, we have our laws and they have their laws. How can we assume that only our laws are correct? And if they're correct, then we should go there and say exactly what we have in mind over there. But since we cannot, because they have their laws, we must understand that we have to work and live together on this planet. Now that's number one point. The second point is, a lot of Muslims, not only Muslims, a lot of commentators will say, you're very keen to talk about freedom of speech. Are you prepared to say things about other communities? You're not. You will not say anything about other communities, minority communities, because there'll be an uproar in the media, as there is any time anything is said about the other communities. But Muslim communities, you have a free-fall. Have you ever heard Fox or any other channel that go on and on about Muslims saying those kinds of things about other communities? They don't. So why do we have these clearly double standards? If you really believe in freedom of speech, it should really apply to everyone. You know, this is a great principle. Everyone should be free. And I believe that philosophers like Voltaire, like the great French philosophers, they actually believed this. So they mocked everyone. They mocked the church, they mocked the Catholic Church, the Pope, the Prophet, Islam. That was different because they're living in a world where to them all religions are bunk. But you can't select one religion and say, okay, I'm going to constantly bully and harry and abuse this one, and the rest, well, no, actually we don't. We actually love you and you're fine, but freedom of speech for this particular one. So we have to think about these issues.
We have time for 2 more questions.
I had a question. In your talk, you talked a lot about, towards the end, the steps that could be taken to help repair relations for Muslims living in the West. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to how that could be done in the Middle East regarding what you said about the core versus the periphery, especially given that you said America should have limited engagement in this region, seeing as we don't know what it is we'd want out of that sort of situation, out of intervening.
That's an excellent question because that involves policy decisions, the administration understanding all the nuances, which they try very hard to do, understanding what you have in your hand, what levers do you have, particularly now. Remember, 9/11 is a different world to now, completely different world. Let me tell you the difference. 9/11 happens, the second or third day, Armitage, working with Colin Powell, rings the President of Pakistan's head of intelligence, head of ISI. An official from Washington ringing directly the President of Pakistan's office. And he says, I'm giving you half an hour. You either join us or we'll bomb you into the Stone Age. And President Musharraf, martial law administrator, jumps 6 inches into the air and says, we are on, we are with you. Today, the President threatened the President of Syria, Middle East power, not nuclear, not an established army. And he said, I draw a red line, you cross this red line, I'll blast you. He crossed the red line, crossed it again, crossed it 50 times. It's not the same. You threaten someone, you huff and puff, nothing happens. Because we have changed here. We don't have President Bush here in Washington. People know this. People know that America is now not the America it was 10 years ago. Having understood that, you then need to say, okay, what do I have in my hand? The United States is a very powerful country. If it has a different kind of strategy, it can use, for example, education, colleges, universities. Now, don't underestimate the power of a college. I was educated at Foreman Christian College in Pakistan. It's the leading college, Christian college in Pakistan, which has produced presidents, parliamentarians, prime ministers. Very influential. Who runs it? American Presbyterians, even today. So think of it. One good college, now university, has an impact on future generations. So suppose you said, all right, Middle East, you talked about the Middle East, we are going to make the best universities right in the heart of Kurdistan, Baghdad. We'll give it to Syria. We'll put it in Yemen. You provide the security, but we'll give you the best colleges, best universities, best teachers, best conferences. Get your best students here. We'll train them, send them back. Overnight, you're changing that entire society. Now, weigh your costs. Against that, you're using drones and missiles, and where has that got us? Thousands and thousands of people dead, millions of dollars of property destroyed. Nothing has been achieved. One good university, Foreman Christian College, has produced generations of Pakistanis who absolutely love and are grateful to Americans for the education they got. So these are things we can use when you balance what you can give to a country in order to promote your policies.
This is in relation to your talking about the law of the land and so forth, and Muslims saying that America is the best place for Muslims. How do you respond then to the Muslim groups that are trying to get Sharia law so that they are not held accountable to U.S. law?
Which Muslim groups are wanting the Sharia law? Could you tell me which they are?
Well, what I had read about was in some groups in Michigan. I don't know specifically, and maybe it's not even true.
This is one of those urban myths.
Okay.
Please don't believe it.
Okay.
Let me explain it to you. The Muslim population, now just follow me very carefully. The Muslim population is about 2%, right? The United States is a democracy, right? We go by the law, by the vote. If 98% people here do not want something called the Sharia law, even if, I repeat, even if every Muslim wants the Sharia, which they don't, how can those 2% impose their will on 98%? Does it make any sense to you? So when someone tells you this, could you please next time say 2 + 2 = 4, it doesn't equal 7 or 8. And that should finish the argument. This argument I've heard, it's one of those bogies that's been lifted up and exaggerated and talked about. It is meaningless. And frankly speaking, it embarrasses someone like me who has such high regard for the intelligence of the American people. Because when I'm abroad, people ask me this, they say, how can Americans believe this when you have not even 2% population, 99% of that population would not even conceive the idea of a Sharia. Why? Because they're escaping Muslim lands to come here. Do you think they want the Sharia? If they wanted the Sharia, don't you think that they would have first imposed it in a country like Pakistan, where 98% of people are Muslim? So ask yourself this. If 98% people living in Pakistan are not imposing the Sharia on themselves, why should they come to America and then want to impose it on 98% of people who are not Muslim? The mathematics makes no sense to me. I mean, there may be some mathematical geniuses in the audience. Kate, are there any people from the mathematics department? They could explain this. But it's beyond me, a simple anthropologist. It doesn't make sense. Thank you very much, Kate.
That concludes this evening's program. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Ahmed.